Thank you.
Well, thank you. That was a great talk, Andy, and really, in many ways, sets me up for my talk very well. First of all, I'd like to thank HBIC for inviting me to speak today, and congratulations on 20 years doing a great job. And I don't know, as I haven't been here, whether anybody's mentioned it, but another major anniversary this year was Nikki getting past 35 years working for Hampshire County Council, having joined in February 1987, and that requires applause, I think, but we'll do that at the end, maybe. So congratulations, Nikki.
I thought you were going to mention I hit 60 this year. I'm glad you didn't.
Oh, really? Well, we can talk about that later, maybe.
No.
Yeah, well, there's probably not many people under 60 on the call, so I wouldn't worry about that. So I'm going to first of all talk a little bit about the history of bird recording in Hampshire. So that top left hand Hampshire Bird Report, which is rather attractive. Yeah, I mean, Nikki would have been 4 years old when that appeared. Sorry to mention that again. But anyway, as we look through there, you'll see the Hampshire Bird Report's got more attractive over the years, more use of colour and photographs, and the bottom right is roughly where we are now. We haven't changed our design in the last 10 years. But I did want to just show how in the last 20 years, the number of people being involved and the number of records has really rocketed. Now in 2001, here we have the figures, so 249 species, which actually is roughly what we get today still, but only 316 observers and 31,000 records. If you look to the most recent report, which we published just a few months ago, you see the number of species is a little bit higher. 1,600 observers, getting on for 400,000 records. And I'm pleased to say we also managed to include 110 colour photos this time. So yeah, things are getting better. If you're a county recorder, it means it's life getting harder. You've got to delegate more. And that's certainly one of the things I've done in the last few years. Very pleased to say that people like Amy are really helpful as the assistant recorder and other people on the team too. If you look at the number of observers sending in records, though, in many ways, I wish I was the county recorder back in 1950, when there were only 50 people you had to deal with. You probably knew them all personally. Now I have over 1,600 people sending in records, which is a lot. And but it's interesting still to see where those records come from. So this is a map showing you the distribution of records sent in. This is not the number of species, this is the number of actual records sent in 2020. And as you can see, the hotspots, which are actually both red and blue in this case, are down on the coast, well-known places that people love going for walks and watching birds. But just look at the number of areas where there are no birds, no records sent in at all, or less than 10. So anything that's white or blue, less than 10 records, which is pretty shocking. Looking at where the observers are sending in records from, it's a similar sort of pattern, and you can see a big focus down around the major conurbations and also the popular bird watching sites. So one of the things we're trying to do in HOS is direct people to go to places where they wouldn't normally go. And if you're watching this and thinking, well, I live near one of those white or blue squares, please do get in touch and let me have some records for 2022. Where do we get our records from? Well, it's similar to other groups, I think, although we've got two very good recording systems for birds, BirdTrack and ebird. BirdTrack is run by the BTO. ebird is an American system run by Cornell, but it's growing fast. And we still have our old-fashioned Excel spreadsheets. Still have actually 3 people who send in their records handwritten as well, which is quite interesting because they often say, oh, I'm way too old. I'm 70, I'm way too old to know how to use a computer. And then I tell them their records are actually transcribed onto a computer by a lady who's 82, which I think is probably puts them to shame. And I think she's on the call. So thank you, Jane Calderon, for that. In fact, I think you're 81, sorry about that. So some birds are going up in number, some are going down. Of course, this happens all the time. Gone already are these species. They no longer breed in Hampshire. They all did. And indeed in recent times, but they've gone now. And in addition to that, we've got some others that are declining fast right now, birds that quite frankly could well disappear in the next 20 years, and indeed for some of them the next 5 or maybe 10 years. But we do have arrivals. So the arrivals since 1960, with those that arrived since 2001 in red. And when I say arrived, I mean became breeding species in the county. So we've now got cattle egret, eider, goshawk, avocet, ringneck parakeet, and raven, none of which we had at the time when HBIC was set up. The eider is particularly unusual. It's the only nesting pair of eiders in southern England, and they are down at Keyhaven and they nest every year. So I wonder how long that will continue. So yeah, it's a bit like an airport, I'm afraid. So some departures and some examples of this. Willow tit, a sad case. Willow tit is a bird that used to be widespread across the county, and now I'm afraid I didn't even see one last year or the year before, and I haven't seen one this year, I don't think, very well. And it's only found in 2 areas. And interestingly, these are at the higher altitudes, so around about 170 meters high, which indicates perhaps that these birds are looking for areas where the temperatures are a little bit cooler. Maybe that's more to their liking. Not totally clear, because there's probably other things at play here. Willow tits maybe will be suffering from fragmentation of woodland, and also the fact that some woods are maybe not in the best condition, and coppice, which is their favourite habitat, sometimes is done rather industrially rather than carefully for wildlife. Wood warbler, a real focus there on the New Forest, and that map actually is all the records for 2020, as was the willow tit. Now, I think that rather makes it look better than it is, because some of those birds will have moved around before settling down. I think we're going to lose wood warbler, and one of the real indications behind their decline could well be the lack of insects at the time when they want to feed their young, suitable insects I mean by that, and quite likely their young go hungry. And I do know of a case where a nest was predated by a tawny owl in the middle of the night, perhaps because the chicks were still calling in the night because they were still hungry, not having had enough insects during the day. Turtle dove, of course, is another one that we're probably going to lose. Now, these again are all 2020 records. That'll include a few migrant birds. There's really 2 main populations in Hampshire. One is at Martin Down over in the west, and the other one is at Charlton Down on the border with Sussex. Now, this is a nationally declining species. It's across the whole country. We're not entirely sure what's wrong there. They are shot on their migration, and where they winter in places like Senegal, the habitat is not very suitable these days. But those are birds that are really doing badly. But the good news is that, you know, we are seeing arrivals, and the arrivals going back over the last 60 years ago. Look at this, you know, when Nicky was just appearing on the scene, so was Firecrest in 1961. Sorry to mention that, Nicky, it's just a good reference point. And Mike Adams found them nesting in the New Forest for the very first time, the first nesting ever in Britain. Now look at all the records from last year. They're right across the county. Similarly, John Taverner in 1968 found a Mediterranean gull nesting at Needs Oar. These now are right along the coast. They don't nest everywhere, but they do travel up and down the coast, and indeed inland. So a bird that has really become much more common. Indeed, 1,700 pairs nest in Langstone harbour in some years. The Chetti's warbler found, the first record for Britain actually was in, I think, 1961 or thereabouts in Hampshire, and they started nesting in 1979. And they're now along the coast, they're up the valleys, and they're clearly benefiting from a more milder winter because they're a warbler that doesn't migrate. Little egret, which arrived in the 80s and then has spread right throughout the county. It's not breeding everywhere, it's only breeding in about 5 places, but these are the areas where they're seen during the year. So everybody sees little egrets, but now not only that, you now see this, the Great White Egret. It hasn't actually nested successfully in Hampshire yet, to our knowledge, but we think they will, probably at Fish Lake Meadows, maybe this year. They certainly tried to nest in 2020. So this bird arrived just a few years ago and now is seen regularly, a very large version of a little egret, really. And breeding soon in Hampshire, perhaps Betton and Spoonbill, both of which are present during the summer, and I suspect Fish Lake Meadows will be the place where Bittons nest. Who knows where Spoonbills will end up, but they surely will nest within the next 10 years. So when we're thinking about climate change, it's not the only thing that's causing changes for our birds. Some of the biggest changes we've seen have been loss of habitat. But right now, climate change is fast on the tail of habitat loss as the second largest cause and driver of declines, and indeed changes. Not every bird is suffering from climate change, some are benefiting, but there are clearly some changes. And I just really wanted to say that, you know, when we think about climate change, it isn't something that's brand new. If you go back over the last 450,000 years, you'll see that in that time, there have been 5 different warm periods, including the one we're just going into now. And these have been created over time, over thousands of years, by the tilt of the Earth in relation to the sun. So it's a natural process and very slow, taking thousands of years, whereas the current change, driven by human activity, is coming through in hundreds of years. And in some cases, birds are struggling to catch up because it's too fast for them. There is, of course, plenty of evidence of what's been going on. If you follow the news reports, you'll be aware of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change putting out their various reports. This shows that already climate change has driven an increase by 1.2 degrees centigrade. And what we're trying to avoid is it going beyond 1.5, which is why we're doing so much to try and stop it. And there are various different scenarios. An SSP, a lovely term, shared socioeconomic pathway. There are 5 or 6 SSPs, there are 5, showing the various degrees to which we would suffer if we didn't do the right thing. So there's a lot of information. There's also information showing how the Arctic sea ice area is also declining. And of course, that if you look at the dotted line at the bottom, that is the point at which there will be no ice in the Arctic. And if there's no ice in the Arctic, then our sea levels are going to rise very fast indeed. So let's just quickly see, and I'm not an expert on this, but just see how birds are being affected by climate change in Hampshire. So there are 4 main ways. Their distributions are being altered. There are some gains and some losses. I'll talk about those. Some of the birds that are migrants, they arrive earlier than they used to. Not all of them though. And there are some benefits and costs in terms of survival, for example, warmer winters, and so on, and more rainfall or less rainfall in certain areas of the world. And I think behind that there's the general picture, which we don't think about too often, although we should, which is that sea level rises will affect both feeding and resting areas for our birds. So take the first example then, Willow Tit. So Willow Tit is a bird that we have almost lost, as I mentioned with that map earlier. And if you look at the change map in the most recent Hampshire Bird Atlas, you'll see there that all those red squares are places where they were on the previous atlas in the 80s and 90s, and then they'd gone by that time. A very sad picture indeed. If you look at this, it's a picture from a book, a fantastic book published in 2007 called The Climatic Atlas of Birds. And what that did is it analysed the current distribution of all the birds breeding in Europe, and then it calculated that if we had a 3 degrees centigrade rise in temperature by 2100, which is about the worst case scenario, what would the bird distributions look like? And they computer modeled that. So this is how the current distribution of Willow Tit was back around about 1990, which is when they stopped their analysis. And here's the prediction. And you can see the prediction is that Willow Tit goes further north. I'll just go back so you can see that. I'll just go between those two and you can see how right across Europe, the distribution goes north, but basically it goes northeast. And that is the prediction by the scientists on most species in Europe, that over that 100 years from now, or not quite now, but 80 years from now, those birds will move on average 550 kilometers northeast from where they were in 1990. So we have predicted this. For many species, it doesn't really matter perhaps because they were in the south and now they're going to be in the north. But if you're a bird that's already in the north, where are you going to go? It's a bit like being in a room which is suddenly too hot and then for you, and then finding out there's no room that's any cooler. You're not happy at all. The second way birds are affected is by earlier arrivals of migrants. And I'm going to give you the example of the swallow, which is a common bird, of course. Swallows in 1963, if you look at the black line, ignore the other lines, or look at the green line and the black line. Swallows basically in 1963, the average arrival date was the 30th of April. If you move that forward to 2010, you'll see that that arrival date is now the 21st of April. Okay, it's only a week earlier, not a big deal, but it hasn't taken very long to make that change. And you may have read in the papers that this winter, something like 100 swallows actually spent the winter in Britain rather than migrating to Africa. So there are some interesting changes like that. Birds arriving earlier, maybe they could take advantage of a longer breeding season, rear an extra brood of chicks. That might be good for them. That might be a really, really helpful move. If you look at this graph, I have to explain it, this is the arrival dates of all the main common migrants. So the arrival date in the 1960s is on the bottom, a bit like Andy showed, but this is the day of the year going through out of 365 days. And then the same on the left-hand side. Now, basically, if you put that line through as a red line, if they all arrived on the same day, they'd be on the line. But as you can see, they're below the line, which means they're now arriving earlier than ever before. So to give you an example, the probably extreme case really would be the sand martin, which is the one that you can see in the sort of middle at the bottom. Back in 1963, that used to arrive on the 17th of April on average. And now in 2010, it arrived on the 21st of March. So you can see how this has changed so many of the species. They're arriving earlier. But it's not necessarily so good for the cuckoo. The cuckoo is one that doesn't particularly arrive much earlier than it used to. It's moved forward by about 4 days, I believe. So by the time the cuckoo arrives, cuckoos that want to nest in the nests of dunnocks or meadow pipits are disadvantaged because those birds by that time already have not only eggs, but usually have chicks in their nests, and the cuckoos miss the opportunity of nesting with them. So they have to wait if those birds have a second brood. But each cuckoo actually specializes in a particular host species. So those that specialize in the reed warbler, well, they're going to be okay because the reed warbler arrives with the cuckoo and has barely changed its arrival date. So those are still okay. But those that used to nest with dunnocks are going to miss half the opportunities that they used to have, and the same with the meadow pipit. So the cuckoo is maybe not going to be so happy with the climate change, unless, of course, over time, it learns to arrive earlier. And of course, evolution does mean that birds do eventually learn to come earlier. There are also costs and benefits depending on the weather, which will affect your survival. And a couple of examples here. I just want to show you a chart which shows the winter temperature in the UK, which is the blue line. And you can see there we've had a number of severe winters, but not many. And you can see the red line, which is actually the population of the grey heron. And you can see there that the grey heron's population does well when there are not cold winters. So we're going to have more mild winters. Herons, I think, are going to be one of the beneficiaries of that. Not just herons, but the egrets and other herons that may still be to arrive in the UK. Bittens too. But not just in the UK. What about this? The redstart, a beautiful arrival summer migrant, spends its winter down in Africa, has to go across the Sahara in order to reach where it's going to be. As you can see, the red is where it's in summer, the blue is where it's in winter. And where that bird is wintering and where that bird is migrating through in order to get to its wintering areas looks like this, the edge of the Sahel in Africa. Now, if you look at the rainfall in the Sahel, we've actually been through a period in the last few years where the rainfall's been quite good. If you look at the red line for the redstart, it's the breeding numbers in the UK. And you can see that generally speaking at the moment, breeding numbers of redstarts are increasing. And that may well be because their survival levels in Africa are actually quite good at the moment. So really what I'm saying is that the changes in weather, not only just here, but also in places like Africa, are going to affect quite a lot of our birds. And the fourth area, as I mentioned, is sea level rises. This is a purple sandpiper. I took that photograph a couple of months ago down at Southsea Castle. If you're not familiar with Southsea Castle, here it is. And the purple sandpipers roost and feed on the rocky bit just below the castle, where you can see all that lovely seaweed growing. Now that is about to be completely changed, because sea level rises mean that those fortifications need to be improved, and so there's going to be a lot of building work going on there. So some of our birds are being disadvantaged by the rise in sea level. Thankfully, the people doing this particular project have thought about the purple sandpipers, and they're actually growing algae and seaweed on rocks at the moment, which they'll be able to put in place once they've created the new front there at Southsea. But there are many, many situations where over the next 100 years, our birds are going to be disadvantaged by the level of seawater rise, depending on how severe that is. So in summary, there are some winners, there are some losers. I think as people who work in wildlife and conservation, we need to think about that. We need to plan ahead so that we can think about what the wildlife will need in the next 100 years, rather than necessarily always thinking about what's happening right now. And I think also, you know, alone, none of us can achieve these things. We can only achieve them when working with others. And my own thought is that HBIC is a perfect example of an organisation to work with. Without organisations like HBIC, we'd be much poorer. And with that, I'll hand back to you, Nikki. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Keith. That's very kind words, and some fascinating images and graphs there, and some quite sobering ones as well. Obviously, with not knowing what's coming along with climate change. Okay, we are running a few minutes behind, so I'm gonna, there was one question, and maybe just a very quick answer. It concerned the impact of feeding birds, that willow tits lose out to blue and great tits who take advantage of food and then drive willow tits from their nesting holes. Do you think that's part of the story?
Well, certainly that has been one of the stories that's been put forward. There's no doubt about it that willow tits are quite timid birds. They are less aggressive than marsh tits, which they look like, and they live alongside, and similarly less aggressive than great tits. Whether it's feeding birds that's driving the growth of great tits, I don't know. What I do know is that they seem to fall out with marsh tits a lot, and indeed marsh tits now, I think, evict them from their homes. So it might be a factor, but I don't think it really is a strong factor. I think the main factor is a combination of climate change, habitat change, and a bird that's now at such a low level that it can't survive. They are doing quite well further north. If you go to the Midlands, for example, it's a commoner bird than the marsh tit. So I suspect it's driven probably mostly by climate.
Yeah, okay. Thanks very much, Keith.